Ukraine's powerful presidential chief of staff Andriy Yermak has resigned after anti-corruption investigators raided his home and office, triggering one of the most dramatic political shakeups in Kyiv since Russia's full-scale invasion and injecting new uncertainty into Aide, Ukraine peace talks. His departure removes President Volodymyr Zelensky's most influential aide and chief peace negotiator just as Washington presses hard for a settlement with Moscow. On a cold morning in Kyiv, as Ukraine fights for its survival on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, anti-corruption officers walked into the heart of power, and walked out having toppled the second most powerful man in the country. Tonight, we're breaking down why the raid on Andriy Yermak, President Volodymyr Zelensky's chief of staff and top peace negotiator, could reshape Ukraine's war, the US-backed peace talks, and even the balance with Russia. Andriy Yermak wasn't just another official in Kyiv. Officially, he was the head of the presidential administration, but in practice, he was often described as Ukraine's second most powerful man. A longtime confidant of Zelensky, Yermak rose from lawyer and media producer to the center of political power after Zelensky's 2019 election, eventually controlling access to the president, shaping key appointments, and overseeing much of Ukraine's foreign policy and wartime diplomacy. For supporters, Yermak was the hyper-effective fixer who kept Zelensky's wartime government running and coordinated crucial Western aid. For critics, he was the embodiment of excessive concentration of power, accused of shielding allies and feeding a culture of impunity at the top. Early on Friday, Ukraine's anti-graft agencies made an unprecedented move. They searched Yermak's apartment inside the heavily guarded presidential compound and, according to officials, also targeted his office. The operation was led jointly by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO, acting under court authorization as part of an ongoing investigation. Cut to quick explainer graphic, Ukraine's anti-corruption system. Yermak publicly confirmed the raid in real time, saying investigators faced no obstacles, that they had full access to his apartment, and that his lawyers were present, a signal he wanted to project cooperation, not defiance. At the same time, spokespeople for the anti-corruption bodies declined to spell out exactly what they were looking for, citing legal limits around revealing details of an active case. That ambiguity left one question hanging over Kyiv and its Western partners: was this about Yermak personally, or about the wider scandal already rocking Zelensky's government? To understand this raid, you have to zoom out to a widening corruption scandal in Ukraine's strategic energy sector. Earlier this month, NABU and SAPO opened a sweeping probe into an alleged scheme worth around $100 million in kickbacks tied to the country's state energy infrastructure and nuclear sector. The investigation has already forced the resignation of at least 2 cabinet ministers and implicated a former business associate from Zelensky's entertainment industry days. Anti-corruption officials have not publicly named Yermak as a suspect in that energy case, and his spokesperson says he has not received any formal notice of suspicion. But politically, the optics are devastating. The president's chief of staff, already under fire over his powerful role and his inner circle, suddenly finds his home and office searched in the middle of the largest graft probe of the war. Several of Yermak's former deputies had already left government amid earlier corruption investigations, further fueling public perception that the network around him was at the center of recurring scandals. By the end of the day, Zelensky made a move that stunned even some of his critics. In his nightly address, he announced that he was resetting the presidential office, and that Andriy Yermak had submitted his resignation. For a leader who had resisted months of pressure, including from lawmakers in his own party, to remove Yermak, this was a dramatic reversal. Some members of the ruling Servant of the People faction had warned the president that keeping Yermak in place despite the energy scandal could split the party and erode public trust. Zelensky framed the decision as a move to protect national unity in the middle of war and to deny Russia any chance to exploit internal divisions. He argued that Ukraine could not afford political games or doubts about its commitment to clean government while facing intense U.S. pressure over a peace deal. EU officials, who have tied Ukraine's membership bid to aggressive anti-corruption reforms, said the searches showed that Kyiv's anti-graft institutions were doing their job, a subtle but important signal that Brussels will be watching what happens next. Yermak's fall doesn't just rearrange offices in Kyiv. It directly hits Ukraine's negotiating team at a moment of maximum pressure from Washington. In recent weeks, Yermak had been leading Kyiv's side in talks with the US on a 28-point peace plan strongly criticized in Europe for leaning too far toward Russian demands, including territorial concessions and limits on Ukraine's armed forces and NATO prospects. Ukrainian and European officials pushed back, and Yermak's team was credited with forcing revisions to that proposal. Now, the delegation that will face US envoys is being rebuilt on the fly. Zelensky has announced a new team led jointly by Armed Forces Chief Andriy Yermak, Foreign Minister Andriy Yermak, and National Security Council head Rustem Umerov, with representatives from intelligence services also at the table. Russia is watching closely. Officials in Moscow have already suggested that the scandal and the political uncertainty in Kyiv make it even harder to predict Ukraine's next move, even as the Kremlin signals it remains open to negotiations on its own, maximalist terms. This crisis cuts to the core of Ukraine's long-standing struggle with corruption, a problem that didn't vanish when Russian tanks rolled across the border. For years, Ukraine has ranked among Europe's most corrupt states, and cleaning up governance is now a condition for joining the European Union. Brussels and G7 partners have praised Ukraine for building independent anti-graft institutions and for prosecuting senior officials during wartime, but they've also warned against any attempts to bring those agencies under political control. Earlier this year, when Zelensky tried to shift oversight of NABU and SAPO to the Prosecutor General, it triggered Ukraine's first major anti-government protests since the full-scale invasion, along with sharp criticism from the EU. Under pressure, Kyiv reversed course and reaffirmed the agency's independence. That background is crucial. The fact that those same agencies have now rated the president's chief of staff is being used by Ukraine's partners as proof that no one is untouchable, but domestically, it also exposes just how close the corruption storm has come to Zelensky's inner circle. Inside Ukraine, the Yermak raid poured fuel on a simmering political crisis. Lawmakers from Zelensky's own party had recently broken ranks publicly, demanding Yermak's ouster and even floating the idea of a national unity or cross-party government to restore trust. Some argued that even if Yermak was not personally charged, he bore political responsibility for the energy scandal and for the accumulation of power in the presidential office. One senior lawmaker summed it up bluntly: of course he had to go. Zelensky, who built his presidency on a promise to break the system of oligarchic and political corruption, is now navigating a paradox. To maintain Western support and domestic legitimacy, he has to show that legal institutions can operate without fear or favor, even when that means sacrificing the trusted lieutenant who has been at his side through nearly 4 years of war. Whether this resets the system or simply shifts power to a new inner circle will depend on who replaces Yermak and how transparently the investigations proceed. So what does the fall of Andriy Yermak actually change in the broader war? First, it injects uncertainty into the peace track. The US is pushing hard for a deal, Russia is holding firm on sweeping demands, and Ukraine has just lost the architect of its negotiating strategy. A more collective, security-heavy delegation might stiffen Kyiv's resistance to territorial concessions, or it might be a way for Zelensky to share political risk if compromises become unavoidable. Second, it will shape how willing Western governments, and their taxpayers, are to keep funding Ukraine's war effort and reconstruction. Every high-profile corruption case, and every resignation at the top, becomes part of the argument either for continued support or for pulling back. And finally, it sends a message far beyond Ukraine, that even in the middle of a brutal, grinding war, modern states are expected to fight 2 battles at once, against external aggression, and against corruption inside their own elites. How Ukraine balances those fights will help determine not just the outcome of its war with Russia, but whether it eventually takes its place inside the European Union. The raid on Andriy Yermak's home and his shock resignation have cracked open the inner circle around President Zelensky at a pivotal moment in the war. Is this the start of a cleaner, more institutional Ukraine, or a sign that wartime politics in Kyiv are becoming even more fragile? If you want to keep tracking how corruption, war, and great power diplomacy collide in real time, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. In the coming days we'll be digging into the US peace plan itself, what's on the table, what Ukraine says is non-negotiable, and how far Washington might go to end this war. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.